I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. Happy Pride, and thanks so much for tuning in to the podcast built to broaden and decolonize classical music. Speaking of Happy Pride, I have some queer news that I'm going to get into in today's TRILLOQUY. So be sure to stick around for that. But to get us into today's chat, I'm thinking about the fact that I'm on a little bit of a conductor streak here on TRILLOQUY. Last time I shared with you a conversation with Peter Askim from the Next Festival of Emerging Artists. Shout out to Peter, and thanks again to him for joining me. And today you get to hear from another maestro, the incredible Dane Lam. Now, if you do a quick Google search, you'll see headlines that describe Dane Lam as the first conductor of non-Chinese nationality to lead a major Chinese orchestra. He's currently serving as the principal conductor of the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra. But as you'll hear in our chat, identity, ethnicity, and politics are a whole lot more nuanced than what you might read online. So I'm really glad to expand and broaden conversations as it relates to that bit of his profile as it is pushed forward in the public. In addition to leading that orchestra in China, the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra, he leads an opera orchestra in Australia and the major orchestra over in Hawaii. So he has a lot going on and a lot to share about a wider view of expanding repertoire and decolonizing classical music. We had a really great conversation. In our chat, Dane also shares his journey of uncovering the music of Dai Qiang Li, who was a brilliant mid-20th century Chinese-American composer whose music Dane is dedicated to bringing back to the front and just really highlighting. He's a composer who I had not heard of, and I'm really glad to have him on my radar now, thanks to Dane, and I'm sure that's the case for a lot of other folks. Dane also talks a little bit about the music of the Hawaiian culture, the indigenous cultures there that he's bringing forward through his role with the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra. So all types of really great and relevant conversations that we engage in this chat. So I hope you enjoy. To get us into my chat with Dane, here he is leading the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra in some music of Mahler, the Titan Symphony, to get us into our dialogue. More from me on the other side.
Yeah, I think classical music, it's undeniable. It essentially originated in Europe, and Europe at the time in which classical music was taking shape and taking form was a culture an unequal culture, as we do live in now still, but it was a culture of colonization. It was a culture of inequality and exclusion. And so that music like art, like so many aspects of the culture, came out of Europe at that time. But now, if we play a Beethoven symphony or a Strauss tone poem or a Mozart opera, as I'm conducting now in Glasgow, I've seen all over the world that these great works of art somehow vivify us, somehow unite us all. And it's something I believe in. I believe in the power of this music, and the music to be able to stand apart, even sometimes apart from its creator, to be able to unify us, to help us work together in the service of something that's greater than ourselves. And I've seen it across cultures in a lot of places, especially places like China, where I have performed a lot of both Chinese music and new music, but also pieces like The Marriage of Figaro. And even today, it's a time of great division. It's a time of a lot of suspicion between nations, between cultures. And So this real people-to-people contact that we have when we're putting these performances together through the rehearsals, through the shows, I think it's testament to what great art and great music can do.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about the work that you've been doing in Xi'an, and even how this phrase classical music fits into the broader conversation. But you've also been quoted as saying diverse voices have always existed. The question is whether we choose to hear them. I wonder where you place this responsibility of choice, or choosing to hear these diverse voices. Is this simply up to conductors and music directors, or is there a role that everyone can play in that conversation, even audience members?
I think that certainly music directors and arts leaders have a special responsibility in making sure that we do perform this music. I mean, because of course, there are certain commercial imperatives, and we're sometimes told, oh, well, new music doesn't sell, or only Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms will sell, or whatever. But I found that there is, of course, a kernel of truth in some of that. But I found that programming music of our time and programming music of our place really does resonate with audiences. It has to be the right piece, of course, and it has to be contextualized in the right way. With my orchestra in Hawaii recently, the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra, we performed a piece by our composer in residence, Michael Thomas Fumai, and the piece was called Reis Hawaiki. And this piece was in English, but also in the Hawaiian language, in Olelo Hawaii. And it's this monumental choral symphony, 60 or 70 minutes long, full choir, full orchestra, multimedia, and it's about the maiden voyage of the Hokulea last century, which itself was a reconstruction of these double-hulled Polynesian voyaging canoes and that sailed across the Pacific Ocean without any modern wayfinding techniques, when the Europeans could barely make it over the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
And this was across the whole Pacific. And so this piece was a tribute to that, but it resonated with our audiences so much. It was our best-selling Masterworks concert of the year, and it got in all kinds of audience members who may not have ordinarily come to a concert. And so, yeah, of course, then conductors, music directors, artistic directors have to play a role in programming this music. It's very important. But of course, individual instrumentalists and singers and musicians can program music in their recitals and their chamber music. And I do think that audiences have a role to play. I mean, the most potent role that audiences can play is to buy tickets, because that sends probably the most powerful signal to administrations and boards, is that, well, this music does make money. And of course, great art has its own intrinsic worth, and I hate to relate it to the almighty dollar, but this is the world in which we live at the moment, and it can be persuasive if we can get audiences for this music. So buy tickets, demand that we play more of it. If you happen to be a very generous philanthropist, you can also support it in that way, through commissioning and through supporting repeat performances of this music.
It's one thing to create orchestral experiences in Hawaii that really speak to Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian communities, to do things like that with your opera company in South Australia, in China. But I wonder what this work looks like when you return to Europe to do this work. Well, what's the sort of converse of this conversation in this so-called home base of Western classical music?
It's a very good question, and it's actually something that I've been grappling with since I've been back in Scotland. For the past few years, and increasingly, my work has taken me to perhaps regions that are not immediately associated with classical music. So, Australia, which is really a very multicultural place that is situated geographically in Asia, Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of Polynesia. And then, of course, China. Well, that's in China. And so I was walking around Glasgow with my wife. And of course, it is a multi-ethnic society, like most places in the world now, most free places in the world. But it's unavoidable that the majority of the population in Scotland is white. The Indigenous people of Scotland are white. So then what does it mean to decolonize the canon in Scotland? Well, I think that there is an interest in hearing music that is not so common, that is outside of these legacy works. So Scottish Opera, for example, recently premiered a Japanese work, The Great Wave, and that's part of what they are doing. I'm thinking of, well, actually, Opera North, that's based down in Leeds, did a really, really interesting collaboration on the Monteverdi Orpheus, which, this music is quite free form. It's not as prescriptive as later music. You can play around with the instruments that might make up the continuo. And so they actually combined Indian classical music and Indian singing with some of Monteverdi's orchestration and created this fusion work. So I think there is demand for it outside of places in which I mostly work. And I really commend these companies for doing that work.
Yeah, I appreciate your perspective on that. It's been something that I've thought about myself. If my life takes me to Western Europe, it's very easy for me here in the United States to argue for the spiritual, for Black music really being that classical tradition. But it seems like that whole conversation would have to shift when you when you go to England or Scotland or another Western European country.
Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for it, really, because it's not something I've had to grapple with directly as the person actually making the programming decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure, what I'm sure of is if you're in Vienna or if you're in Bonn, that the answer is not we need to perform more Beethoven. Not that there's anything wrong with Beethoven. I love Beethoven, but it's something very dull when an artistic program does not take into account the diversity of the community and the diversity of the world.
I agree. So I wonder how, just to take a step back and go into some of your background, I wonder how the various cultures that define your heritage, how that played a role in your early conception and engagement of music in general. What types of music and musicking were you exposed to?
Well, growing up in Australia, I was heavily influenced by my mother, who is Anglo-Celtic Australian, and she loved the ballet. She loved classical music, and so I started playing piano from an early age. But then my dad is from the Chinese diaspora. He was born in Singapore, grew up in Malaysia. And so I always had Chinese culture and by extension, and just by exposure, not really through any design by my father, there was Chinese music, Chinese sounds, Chinese language in my life. It's something that I never really, it was something I grappled with as a kid growing up in Australia in the 90s, which was a more overtly racist place then, especially to Asians, actually, because there was a rise of a very populist party that unfortunately still exists in Australia right now, and it's changed the target of its racial prejudice since I was a kid. But at the time, it was Asian immigration, and so that was something that I struggled with. I wasn't quite sure of my identity, really, and it's almost something that I'm fairly white passing. Most people can tell that I'm not totally white, but people don't really know. And so eventually it all sort of came full circle when I'd gone through my conducting education and worked various places around the world and studied various places around the world and just found myself through some kind of poetic coincidence in Xi'an in China. And it was a really wonderful coming home in a way, because while my father grew up speaking Chinese and grew up as part of the Chinese diaspora, he hadn't actually been to mainland China before. And so I was the first person in my immediate family to go there, and not just go there, but work there and shape the culture of a place.
So what was your journey? Well, actually, before I ask you about getting to the podium, when you talk about the overt racism that you experienced. It seems like, in retrospect, you must identify some proximity between the general culture and what I imagine was a very Eurocentric approach to musical training. I mean, were there Australian or non-European composers that were a part of your education?
Well, now that I think of it, there wasn't really. It was classical music has been and is still in many ways um, an art form that had been reserved for privilege, like opera, like sing, because with some really notable exceptions, there has to be a certain amount of your family has to have a certain amount of financial largesse for you to go down this path, which doesn't always pay very well, especially at the beginning. Um, the interesting thing growing up in Australia, and it's still a phenomenon that I see around the world today, is there was this perception of East Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, as being preternaturally gifted technicians when it came to music, but soulless, without any kind of understanding of the style and the background of the music, which is absolutely, totally, morally, ethically, logically bankrupt, of course. But that is the world in which I was growing up. So I had the people I was going with through youth orchestra and school bands and school choirs. There were a lot of Asians alongside me because there were a lot of Asians, in East Asians in particular, in Australia at the time, and there is now. But there was always this having to combat actively and even passively this perception that, oh, Chinese kids are great technicians, but they don't play with any soul. And that's something that has stayed with me as I've gone on. And perhaps it even caused me to really drill down into the stylistic qualities of the music, what makes Beethoven Beethoven, or makes Brahms Brahms, or to even be overtly demonstrative and passionate while I was playing and then subsequently conducting.
Yeah, it just reminds me of the purpose behind what's been so much of my work. It's one thing to try to decolonize classical music, but it just makes me argue that what we see in classical music is simply the musical representation, the musical manifestation of an overarching conversation that needs to be had, that also shows up in the culinary arts, that shows up in socioeconomic politics. It feels like it all connects. And based on what you're saying, I think there's a really clear demonstration of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think of something like opera singing. And of course, I want to cast as diversely as possible. And it's really important. But this is an art form, particularly somewhere in Australia, that has traditionally been reserved for children whose families have been able to afford a certain level of musical and singing tuition. And so it requires effort, and it requires a different framing of the conversation, and it requires companies to actively engage with artists who are from non-Western backgrounds, from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, and both in casting, but also in terms of creatives and in terms of the collaborations that our company seeks. At my opera company, State Opera South Australia, I was really surprised to hear this because it was only last year, or 2024 perhaps. It was the very first opera co-production ever between an Australian opera company and Chinese opera companies. It was the Magic Flute with Opera Hong Kong and the Beijing Music Festival that was set in the subway of the Hong Kong subway, the MTR, which was really quite cool. This kind of feeling of going between worlds. But I just was shocked. It's rather scandalous in a way that our government has been talking about us being a part of Asia and China being our biggest trading partner for decades now, and yet never having undertaken an operatic co-production, despite the fact that classical music in general and opera in particular is just surging in China.
So, as we talk about these issues, I think it's important to note the opportunity and responsibility, as we've sort of mentioned earlier, of conductors, of music directors to engage this reality. I wonder if you could talk about your first engagements with these responsibilities and opportunities. When did you first make it to a podium? And did you immediately see this not just as your opportunity to lead an ensemble, but to engage this broader narrative?
No, it's something that dawned on me gradually, I think, over time, as I started to become more cognizant of my own cultural background, my own cultural prejudices, and just the depth and breadth of culture in the world. And a lot of it, I think, had to do with me starting in Xi'an back in 2014. It was the most in touch I'd ever been with the Chinese side of my heritage. And through that, apart from performing some of these European works, which was also important for the city to experience, I myself was introduced to so many Chinese composers and Chinese instruments.
Mm-hmm.
Zhao Jiping, Ye Xiaogang, whose music I just recorded with the Liverpool Philharmonic. These are composers that I'd never heard of before. And instruments that I'd never worked with, the pipa, the sheng, the erhu, throat singing from Mongolia, which is very close to Xi'an, actually. All these amazing and eclectic and expressive instruments and ways of making music I first encountered in Xi'an. And then some of my first opportunities as a young conductor with Western orchestras. And obviously it was typecasting and fitting a certain idea of what these orchestras thought they should be doing. But often my first contact with some orchestras was conducting their Lunar New Year concert, which is a double-edged sword. It gets a bit tiring sometimes because, I think I can conduct all music, of course, but it did give me a chance to go to these orchestras and speak not just as an Australian conducting an Australian orchestra, but also as an Australian Chinese artist who had been exposed to this music and these composers and these instruments somewhere in China. And I find that people invariably are just thrilled by the music. Our Lunar New Year concert in Hawaii recently, this was our core Masterworks audience, and they were just blown away by the depth and the breadth of the music.
I read, online just in doing research about you, there are all of these articles and statements that position you as the first non-Chinese music director of a Chinese orchestra, but there must be some tension you feel with that sort of reporting about you, considering your heritage.
Yeah, I mean, Chinese can mean different things, and that's something that I've learned as well. There's politically Chinese, as in, the PRC, and then there's ethnically Chinese. And certainly within mainland China, you're not really viewed as being Chinese unless you were born in the People's Republic. I used to find it really interesting being in a taxi and with my very limited Mandarin saying, "Oh yeah, my father's Chinese," and they said, "Oh, where's he from?" "He's from Singapore." That's not Chinese, even though he's a 100%, Chinese by blood. So I suppose, in the sense, the way that was put forward and was marketed was that I was the first non-Chinese national to have a titled position with a Chinese orchestra. But it is an interesting examination of the intersection of politics and identity and ethnicity, and they don't always align.
So what do you think led to your being able to break that barrier with all of its complications considered? Was it the proximity that you had? Was there a musical aspect that you think helped you cross that barrier?
It's funny, isn't it? I often attribute a lot of these things to luck. It definitely comes down to good relationships and good interpersonal skills. And it just so happened that when I was studying in the UK, in Manchester, one of the percussionists with whom I worked was Chinese and was from Xi'an. And this was a very new orchestra because even today, but especially 10, 15 years ago, all the time there were big, new, fancy, beautiful, acoustically wonderful concert halls being built in cities all around China. And Xi'an, is just a medium-sized Chinese city with the population of around 10 million or so. and so they had built a concert hall, had formed a resident orchestra. They'd only been around a year, and it hadn't worked out with their first music director. And they just started asking around their networks, their overseas networks. And I'd worked with this percussionist, this Xi'anese percussionist, and he recommended me. They flew me out. I did a concert, and it went very well. I do think that even though to the eye of most people in China, they don't see me immediately as Chinese, in terms of the publicity that the orchestra and the narrative of the orchestra went with, I think me being half Chinese did help. I think there was a certain amount of legitimacy that did lend me within China, within the culture, to be able to then come in and grow the orchestra, to grow the audience, to share this music with them.
You mentioned learning so much about Chinese music and Chinese instruments. Here in New York, anytime I see an erhu player on the sidewalk or in the subway, I drop $1 in the case. I really love the sound of that instrument. I've also, as a bassoonist, I've long had an affinity for the flute as a, not just a Western instrument. So I have a lot of Indian bansuris, but I also have a couple of Chinese disa that I love to play. Anyway, all of that to mention, there is a well-established classical tradition in China, thousands of years tradition. I don't have to tell you. I wonder, as a music director of a Western orchestra in China, how are these cultures how do they interplay? Are these different audiences that might go to a traditional Chinese performance than a Western orchestra performance? What's your experience there?
To a certain extent, there are different audiences, but as much as possible, I tried to mix up the programming a little bit. So you would get Tchaikovsky or Brahms on the same concert as a Yeşilgön, Ipak concerto, for example. And people feel immense pride, I think, when they see their instruments on stage alongside so-called famous composers. It's the same thing we do in Hawaii. Hawaii, I've never lived anywhere like it in my whole life. And, I've lived in New York, I've lived in London, both so-called cultural melting pots. But what I love about Hawaii is it's just, the fact I'm half Chinese, half Anglo-Celtic Australian. My son, who was born there, is quarter Chinese, quarter Anglo-Celtic Australian, quarter Brazilian, quarter Colombian. And he's totally normal because the majority in Hawaii is mixed race. And so it's a wonderful open place in that sense. And it allows us to be really daring with our programming, to have all these Asian instruments, to have these Pacific composers. It's a regular part of every single Masterworks concert we do, pretty much. And the audience has really responded to that because the orchestra has an identity that matches the identity of Hawaii.
And we will go over to Hawaii here shortly, but one more question.
No, sorry, I keep on going off on tangents.
No, that's good. I'm sure that mirrors what your air travel looks like. So.
Oh yeah,
but one more question on China. In visiting the website of the Xi'an Symphony Orchestra, I saw that the composer Tan Dun, at least historically, if not presently, has been a part of the leadership of this ensemble. This is a Chinese composer, maybe the Chinese composer that most folks in the United States would recognize. But I imagine there must be communities of Chinese composers who are doing great work whose names don't necessarily make it to the West.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Tan Dun is by far the most famous Chinese composer outside of China. And I think that's largely a function of his films, especially Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And his music is great, but there are so many other composers in China of whom most people haven't heard. Ye Xiaogang, I mentioned him before. We just recorded his music, and he is known outside of China. He's published by Shot. He has some great recordings with orchestras outside of China, but his name is not as well known to somebody in the street, say, as somebody like Tandun Jiajiping, a composer who is from Xi'an. And we performed his Pipa Concerto start last season, or this season actually, in Hawaii. Actually, Ye Xiaogang every year for the past few decades has run this Beijing New Music Festival where not just Chinese composers, but a big cohort of Chinese composers and composers from all around Asia come and share this music. So there is a rich musical culture, a rich so-called classical music culture in China. I mean, the Shanghai Symphony itself is more than 150 years old. That's a very old orchestra, even by Western standards.
Wow. Yeah, I had no idea. So as you lead these orchestras, these institutions across 3 continents, I just wonder how you keep your physical and mentals up to snuff. What's your technique?
It's a learning process, I tell you what. That's for sure. Yeah, it's not always easy, especially with a young family and leadership responsibilities that go far beyond the music making. It's programming and it's fundraising, it's all kinds of policy things and advocacy. Actually, I find increasingly I have to defend our right to exist in a world that sometimes sees it as being superfluous, that sees art and music as being superfluous. So it's important to have time to exercise. That's really important. To eat well, to not drink too much, although I do like wine. And I've just entered my 40s, and sleep is becoming more important.
Sure. I didn't even think to ask about fundraising, but you brought that up, and that makes me go down a whole different path. Is that conversation the same, between Hawaii, Australia, and China? I understand very much the American infrastructure and how, we're all constantly fighting to keep these institutions alive. It seems like in China, the state would help support those activities. What is that story in South Australia?
Yeah, it's a real study in contrasts. So you're right that music in China is largely supported by the state. And then, of course, we both know that in the US, it's almost totally philanthropic, which is really hard because every single year you're starting from scratch. There's nothing guaranteed. You have to always be out drumming up support for the orchestra. And we're just lucky that there are so many generous individuals who support orchestras, that support opera companies, but it is tenuous. Australia is a hybrid of the two. Sometimes I joke it's the worst of both worlds, but we're given enough money from the state and federal government, more or less, to keep the doors open and for some level of programming. But for any kind of daring programs, for new commissions, it is contingent upon fundraising as well, which is, so there's no existential crisis ever for our companies there. We're not going to close the doors, but we still need to fundraise. And it's more difficult in Australia because there's not a culture of philanthropy. This is something that we've been pushed into over decades, just this gradual slide. And it's the same in the UK, actually, this gradual slide of basically stagnating government funding, which in the end amounts to budget cuts, doesn't it? Over time, stagnant funding. And so if you think about what a loaf of bread cost 15 years ago and a loaf of bread costs today, or what you could buy for $100 15 years ago to what you can buy today, it's very different.
That's right.
And that's the situation we find ourselves in Australia. And I believe, talking to my colleagues here in the UK.
Well, it's it's a key aspect of this to make sure that more and more audiences are, not only spiritually supporting these institutions, but also financially. And I feel like a lot of that is done through programming. I think about an opera for our little ones in Australia, a new work that brings in First Nations people, Native communities. I think about the Native centered programming that happens in Hawaii. It's my sense that for you, commissions and developing new work is a key factor in bringing in these new audiences, more so than working to frame Beethoven 9 in a way that engages them, or frame the canon in a way that interests them.
Yeah, look, I mean, I love Beethoven 9. I love conducting Mahler's symphonies. It's all great. And there is a certain amount of framing them in conversation with works in a program that's interesting and illuminating and reveals parts of both cultures. But commissioning is really important to me. I think it's the single greatest act we can make as arts leaders in terms of connecting with communities outside a traditional audience, I suppose. So yeah, this baby's opera, which now has a name, Colini Gu. It's by Nadi Simpson, who is a wonderful First Nations composer. And I was actually inspired by a commission that Scottish Opera made 10 years ago for a baby's opera that was for 0 to 3-year-olds. It's largely nonverbal, and there's a vague story, but it exposes kids to this style of singing and to this acoustical music, which is really important, I suppose. And but we've put a new framing around it by getting Nadi to do this, and it tells a story of Ilba and Myra. It's First Nations story from Australia, and so it's going to expose babies to this music. It's going to expose babies to Nadi's culture, and I just think that's the kind of work that companies need to be doing at all levels to get people in, to engage them and meet them where they are. I think that's really important. Although there is one caveat around us getting more people in. And because I think business-minded people, and I will say this wherever I can because people need to understand this, that business people, funders, whatever, will always say, well, you just need to sell more tickets and then you'll be all right. But there has never been one orchestra in the history of orchestras that has ever sustained itself on ticket sales. Because when you put 50, 60, 70, 80 highly skilled individuals on stage and you have a production crew and you have a hall, the costs will always exceed what ticket sales bring in. And so the reason we fund orchestras, the reason we fund opera companies is because that there is a belief that there is a net benefit to us as a society, just like there is a net benefit to hospitals, like there is to schools or even roads. So that's the argument I always make. We're not a commercial enterprise. We're there as a civic service. And then I suppose you take it to it. If you did want to make it commercial, then you would see ticket prices like some Broadway shows have, which are absolutely commercial. And as a necessity, despite having very, very, very small orchestras, if at all, I mean, they're shrinking the orchestras all over the place on Broadway and on the West End. But they still have New York rents, Broadway rents, West End rents. They've still got to pay their singers and their performers. And so as a necessity, ticket prices are through the roof. I always challenge people when they say that opera is expensive or symphony is expensive. I say, well, have you tried to go to a show on Broadway recently?
The argument that you make about ticket sales is one that I find myself making internally inside of organizations as someone who has worked for an orchestra as a musician and someone who has worked for an orchestra also as an administrator. I'm very sensitive about this sort of culture of management doesn't have the musician's best interest in mind. When I argue that so much of the work of the people on the administrative side is financial because ticket sales will never completely cover everything. I wonder, and then I sit that next to my work advocating for composers, amongst many musicians, certainly not all, but many musicians who say, well, I went to school, I was trained to perform Beethoven, I was trained to perform Brahms. This isn't just a part of this new music, isn't why I took on this gig and went down this line of work. So with all that said, I wonder across, the various orchestras you work with, what your engagement with musicians look like. How do you get buy-in from musicians who, again, weren't trained to play new music, but must as a part of this broader shift that we're advocating for?
Yeah, I try and be as collaborative as possible. And certainly, I know I've noticed a change in musicians over even in the time that I've been conducting, that musicians are by and large more and more open to trying new composers, new works, new styles of playing. But it does require perseverance sometimes. You have to just accept, I think, that in an orchestra of 80 or 90, there are going to be people who don't value the work. But there are people in an orchestra who don't like playing Borodin or don't like playing Mussorgsky. I mean, it's all the same. You're not going to like everything that you play. But if there is a cogent artistic and community and engagement rationale for why we are playing these works, then I find there is buy-in. And also, I think as a conductor on the podium, we must approach new music and these works with as much seriousness as if we're performing Beethoven or Mozart.
How do you keep your ear to the ground when it comes to the growing community of composers? How does a composer get in front of you and eventually get programmed on a concert that you put together?
It's never been easier, in fact, to keep my ear to the ground because of social media, because of YouTube, because of Vimeo. I mean, it really has changed the way we can engage with music, and just to hear a short reel of somebody's music that immediately arrests you. I think, in a way, it's the democratization of music making. It takes away a lot of the gatekeepers. I will say that when I'm looking around for music and I go to a composer's website, if there are audio samples of their work, of the composer's works, it makes it much easier. And even better if there are samples of the scores themselves so I can peruse them. I know that there are sometimes rights and copyright issues for them putting actual recordings on their website, but even just a short note saying for audio samples, please contact blah, 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 blah. It makes it much easier to program that way.
And I would imagine that even with, I don't have to imagine, I know that even with limitations on the copyrights of recordings, not necessarily the pieces of music, but recordings, we have the tools, the MIDI sound files that hopefully, serve a purpose for you when you're looking around where a composer might not have that orchestral recording to offer as a sample.
The MIDI file is certainly better than nothing. But I find if the composers have had their works performed, they will generally be in possession of an archival performance, which is meant to be for personal use, I know. But some real talk here. If you just email it to me, I won't share it with anybody, but it just gives me a flavor of your work.
Is there a specific aesthetic or function on a concert that you have in mind when you're listening to recordings? And I ask this because there's been this long conversation of not limiting new music to the first half of a concert, to the opening piece. So I wonder what you're thinking about aesthetically or programmatically as you're just perusing different composers' works.
Yeah, you're right that is a big challenge, and certainly we've all been guilty of it. Replacing the overture with a piece of new music because it's the easiest thing to do. But I mean, it's not doesn't always have to be like that. Like Ares Havayuki, like the symphonies of Dai Kyung Lee that I want to talk about at some point. This is a really cool story. But it certainly depends on whatever might be a thematic notion of the program. It might be a particular aesthetic, a particular sound world. It's pretty variable, but certainly having access to the scores and to the recordings helps me to place it.
Well, since you brought up those symphonies, how about you share?
Okay, I'm very enthusiastic about Dai Kyung Lee. Dai Kyung Lee was a Chinese American composer who was born in 1915 in Honolulu. He was born, raised, educated in Hawaii, went over to the East Coast to Juilliard and studied there with Copeland and Sessions, had really important premieres with the New York Philharmonic, with the Boston Symphony, with the Sydney and Melbourne Symphonies. He served for the US Armed Forces in the Second World War, and he was prolific. He was shortlisted for the Pulitzer in the 1950s for his Second Symphony. He wrote a violin concerto. He wrote big canticles. He wrote Broadway shows. He wrote ballets. And he died in obscurity in New York in 2005, and nobody had ever heard from him. And then when I was being sounded out as a potential music director of the Hawaii Symphony, just went on some kind of Google deep dive, and I found this guy, Dai Kyung Lee. There were a couple of older recordings of his First Symphony and some of his character pieces, but certainly nothing of the Second Symphony, for which he was his runner-up for the Pulitzer, certainly not his violin concerto, certainly not his Canticle of the Pacific. And so I went to the Library of Congress, found the manuscripts, took a picture of each page, and started to put these pieces back together. And so one of my first concerts as a music director candidate was the First Symphony of Dai Kyung Lee, which was the first modern performance of that. And then last year we performed his Second Symphony, the Pulitzer runner-up piece. And it's such a fantastic and vivid example of this kind of mid-20th century American symphonism. It reminds me of people like Piston, Persichetti. You know, it's a really distinctive flavor, a really distinctive sound world. And so I just keep finding more of these pieces. We're doing the modern premiere of his violin concerto next season. Jennifer Coe's coming out to play it. And it's my ambition to record all this music and release it commercially, because as far as I know, and maybe some of your listeners will correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, for composers working in this space in the mid-20th century, so the symphonic, operatic, balletic, concerto space in the mid-20th century, I don't think there were any other Asian Americans, certainly not working at that level. And so I think this is really, really important work for Asian Americans to see that there was a composer who was doing this work at this high level with the best orchestras in the country and across the Pacific in the mid-20th century.
That's wonderful. And what you're, again, demonstrating when we talked about this sense of responsibility, it's more than strolling over to the music library and picking the score that has a little bit more dust on it. There's labor that's often involved in reviving this music and making sure that it has the same level of respect as a Sibelius symphony or any other work that people might already know.
Yeah, it's really fine work. And I think recording it is really important because, well, we saw it with the works of Florence Price. Now there are a lot of recordings out there of her music. And so certainly as somebody programming, it's always easier to program something if you've heard it, either through performance or through a recording. And if there are no recordings of the music, people are far less likely to program it. So that's why I wanted to undertake this quite ambitious Dai Kyung Lee recording project.
Yeah, and that's very significant. Not at all to pat myself on the back. But, I remember as a radio programmer a decade ago when I would put a Florence Price symphony on the radio, this was a composer no one had heard of. This really felt like a point of discovery. And now 10 years later, we have, I think it was the Philadelphia Orchestra that now has Grammy winning recordings of her work. So just being that one person can flower and bloom into so much.
Yeah, and I think it will mean a lot to so many people. So many classical musicians in the United States and further afield, but especially to Asian Americans working in the field. And there are so many.
So what's coming up next season that you're most excited about?
Well, Dae-Kyung Lee's violin concerto. I don't even know what it's going to sound like. I mean, that's going to be really fantastic. We've got a piece called Song of the Flaming Firebird by Feng Man, and it's a substantial work. It's 35 minutes for a big orchestra with a sheng soloist, the Chinese mouth organ.
Mm-hmm.
So that is going to be a lot of fun. Our composer in residence, Michael Thomas Fumai, we have some new commissions from him. In fact, in June, we're premiering a new work of his in a concert with Renee Fleming that Michael collaborated on with Hawaii's former poet laureate, Brandy Nalani McDougall, who is also a native Hawaiian poet, and she writes such fantastic and vivid poetry, both in conventional English, in Pidgin, in Olelo Hawaii. And Michael is also writing for us. Orchestras perform Peter and the Wolf all the time. But we have quite different animals in Hawaii. And so I said to Michael, what if you take this orchestration and create something that is totally different and really speaks to who we are in Hawaii? Because I think that it will have resonance far beyond Hawaii, actually. I suggested Keoki and the Shark, but he's gone with Lei and the Mo'o. And so that is going to be really interesting.
Wonderful, wonderful. And how can people keep up with all of your global work? Is there a one-stop shop to check out the performances you're leading?
Yeah, I have a website, danelam.net, but I'm most active actually on Instagram, and my handle on Instagram is Traveling Conductor. I post all kinds of reels and stories and carousels and just general musings on the state of the world and what role music has to play in that.
Good for you for claiming that handle before anyone else did.
I know, it's quite a good one. I think, well, a lot of conductors do travel, but I got it first.
That's right. Well, my closing question for you, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about how, I've always wanted to visit Hawaii, but it's hard to ignore the calls for non-Hawaiians, especially mainland Americans, people from the United States, to stay away from the islands, considering how tourism has just put a chokehold on so much. I wonder, with those sorts of narratives considered, what's your personal litmus test for knowing when you're amplifying culture or when culture is being commodified? How do we consider the perspectives of people who want to preserve culture while being stewards of cross-cultural collaboration and conversation?
I think respect goes a very, very long way. Respect and curiosity. So many people who've experienced Hawaii outside Waikiki can never go back to Waikiki because it is commodified in many ways, and it's a pale imitation of what the culture has to offer. So I would encourage people to be respectful of the land, of the Aina. That's really important in Hawaiian culture. And as part of that comes along with that, all the flora, all the fauna, and to be educated on the history of these islands, which I know my wife was born and grew up in New York, and she was not aware at all through her education of the history of the Hawaiian Islands and the history of subjugation and colonization, the eradication of the Hawaiian monarchy. So inquisitiveness, curiosity, respect, and education go a really long way. And also just get out of Waikiki.
Music there by Dai Kyong Lee. That's the hula movement of his Polynesian suite. I really, again, appreciate Dane putting this composer on my radar. I'll definitely be incorporating this into one of my upcoming radio projects that I have coming up. I'm doing a 3-part sort of trilogy of American music, but classical orchestral music, so-called classical music created by Black folks, by American indigenous people, and by immigrant composers. So that's sort of the spin I'm putting on America at 250 as it relates to my radio work. And I think this music by Dai Kyong Lee is a really important contribution to that. So huge thanks once again to Dane Lam for joining me, for introducing me to some new music and having conversations that need to be had, that I don't think all conductors, much less other professionals in the classical sphere, would really dive into. A lot to unpack. There are links in the description if you'd like to learn more about Dane and to keep up with what he has coming up in the 2026-2027 orchestral season. Lots of exciting things. So, as I was just saying, there are a number of things I would love to highlight and expound upon from our dialogue that I think are very important. There's the conversation about identity and culture, not necessarily being one in the same in this industry. We can talk about the stereotype of Asian musicians being soulless, sort of engineers on the instruments without passion or emotion in their playing. When he brought that up, it made me realize that there were a lot of folks, a lot of musicians who I would play with in orchestras who really held that stereotype, that would talk about our Asian colleagues in that very way. So that's a really important conversation. I'm glad that came up. There's even what Dane said about ticket sales not actually keeping institutions afloat. That is a vital piece of information that I believe most people in the field still haven't come to terms with, musicians included. But what I want to focus on for this Trilloquy is connecting Dane's work in Hawaii with an issue and sort of social culture that exists here in New York. So, most people of the more woke persuasion, quote unquote, understand that staying away from Hawaii is more or less the right thing to do. The harm that's been done to those people groups and to those cultures, it really can't be undone. But to show respect for the preservation of what has been maintained, I'm among those who can't really justify going to a resort and being served drinks by someone whose ancestors were systematically wiped out and conquered by the United States. That's just me. What this makes me think of is what's happening in New York more and more and more, and the growing tension between transplants and native New Yorkers. It's not the same conversation, but I think there are a lot of parallels. Just a couple of weeks ago, it was announced that the gay bar in Harlem that Black queer folks like myself would frequent had to shut down due to changes in the neighborhood and people complaining about the noise and all that sort of thing. Everyone online is blaming transplants into Harlem for that closure. And, within this context, it's becoming difficult for people not to side-eye white folks they see walking down 125th or not to have an attitude with people who are asking for directions to Adam Clayton Powell and Frederick Douglass as opposed to 7th and 8th Avenues, respectively. If you know, you know. I for one, don't carry any baggage around being a transplant, because it's been my focus since moving here to New York to contribute and to help nurture what I landed in, not to change anything. I'm not in Harlem proper, as folks who know where I live. I'm just over the border in the bottom part of Washington Heights. But even so, it's a very Dominican and some Mexican folks here as well. That's just the culture of my neighborhood. And one of the things about it is that it's very loud at night. So what that means for me is that, I've learned the Spanish I need to learn to communicate when English isn't preferred, when I'm going into the bodega or into certain establishments. And also the learning to celebrate the all night tree parties that are are very prevalent, especially in the summer, that others might complain about. There's a lot of people moving here who are trying to change the spirit of this neighborhood and their neighborhoods that they land in to fit their needs and what they want, and that's destroying culture and deepening tensions between people who move here and people who have always been here. So bringing this back to Dane's work in Hawaii, I don't think there's any question about what he's doing to make that organization, the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra, one that uplifts and preserves native culture in Hawaii. I have no critiques, because from my perspective, he's not just taking, he's giving and pushing investments back into that culture. That has to sit next to my understanding that there isn't anything at this point that I can necessarily add to that culture by just buying a ticket and going there. So I have to really consider that and just live with that reality, not placing any judgments on his work and what he's doing in Hawaii, and understanding that until I can have that sort of impact, I need to stay away. There is a right way, or at least a better way, to be in Hawaii as a non-Hawaiian, and I believe he's demonstrating that from his positionality. I feel like I'm doing my best to be that here in New York as I utilize my power as an institutional leader to help preserve Harlem, specifically by creating avenues of funding and support to Harlem-based musicians, organizations, and institutions. If I wasn't able to do that, I'm not sure that I would be able to live here as just a taker, considering everything that's going on. That's something that I have to live with. It's not me patting myself on the back. It's me really holding myself to task and making sure that I'm doing my positive part and not just being a taker. I feel like I'm doing my best to be that here in New York, as I think about some of the just material things I can point to. As I record this, tomorrow will be the day when ACF is at the Africa Center over on 5th and 110th, supporting the Sugar Hill Salon and the world premiere of a new chamber work that celebrates Harlem as a uniquely American aspect of this nation's history. That's what I can do and what I'm doing. Again, it's not me patting myself on the back. It's just holding myself to task and demonstrating how to be a good transplant, or a better transplant than those who get queer bars shut down in Harlem. And I can get into the conversation about why Black queer spaces are needed within a queer ecosystem where racism is very pervasive, but that's a whole nother conversation that we don't quite have time for today. So all of this, to ask, I wonder what you can do to preserve and protect culture where you are. Are you taking more than you're giving, or can you measure the positive impact that you're having on the community you exist in, including its preservation and its growth? That's the question that I want to leave you with. It's not a judgment, but it is a challenge to all of us who have ventured beyond where we're from to shift the trajectory of colonization and gentrification in the small ways we can, even through so-called classical music, as Dane is doing it in Hawaii, as I'm trying to do it here in New York. I think there are ways for us to use this art form to not only decolonize the art form, but to decolonize the way that we think about moving to different places, the way that gentrification takes hold of these communities. We have that power, and we have to challenge ourselves to utilize that power and to utilize our creativity to really support efforts to preserve culture, preserve neighborhoods, whatever that looks like wherever we are. And that's what I have. for today. Thanks again for tuning in. It's a privilege to have this platform and to have you as an audience member. You can check out past opuses and learn more about this show at trilloquy.org, TRILLOQUY.org. And more from me soon. Until then, peace.